There are days in history when a nation does not shout, yet the whole world hears its voice. There are hours when ordinary people, elders with trembling hands and quiet memories, rise higher than any parliament or palace. And there came such a day in Jamaica, a day when grandmothers in Kingston whispered, "Enough." A day when veterans in Montego Bay placed their hands upon their hearts, remembering the battles life had carved into their souls. A day when the island, worn by storms both political and spiritual, finally turned its face away from the West and looked instead toward dignity. For many Jamaicans, this awakening did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a memory of who they once were and who they could become again. And as Africa rose, as new voices from the Sahel challenged the old order, Jamaica felt something stir within its chest. So family, if you believe that truth still has power, if you believe that elders still carry the key to freedom's door, then press subscribe and stand with this growing African-Caribbean circle. This story begins softly, but it will not end softly. Pastor Reynolds once said that truth does not arrive like a marching band. It arrives like a tremor beneath the feet, a vibration in the soil, a whisper in the bones of the old. That is exactly how Jamaica felt in the early hours of that fateful week. The island was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. Markets opened as usual, fishermen pulled in their nets, schoolchildren trod the same dusty roads. Yet beneath all of that, something was shifting. Something old, something righteous. It began not with politicians, but with elders. Sister Marlene, a retired nurse from St. Andrew, was the first to speak aloud what many had felt for years. She stood in a small church hall, the type with a tin roof and the smell of old wood, and said, "We have been signing our future away, and none of us was told." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with age and anger intertwined. Around her, the congregation nodded. They had seen too much, buried too many dreams, and survived too many storms to ignore the truth any longer. By then, murmurs had begun to spread about a set of historical agreements between Jamaica and various Western institutions. Agreements that had shaped the economy, dictated fiscal decisions, and pushed entire generations into dependency. Some of these documents were public, some semi-public, and some lived only in memory and rumor. But when one parliamentary committee finally raised the question, why were these terms never explained to the people? The island woke up. Veteran Osborne, a man who had served abroad under the Jamaican flag more than 5 decades earlier, shook his head as he listened to the live coverage. "This is not just politics," he said. "This is our dignity." His grandchildren gathered around him, not fully understanding the weight of his words, but sensing the gravity. He told them stories of Jamaica's early years of independence, the years of dream and defiance, the years when the island stood tall, years long buried under pressure, exploitation, and silence. Then came the parliamentary session that ignited the fire. Professor Grant, a long-respected historian, spoke plainly before the committee. Jamaica's issue is not merely corruption or mismanagement. It is the fact that our sovereignty was quietly signed away in pieces, and we allowed ourselves to believe it was normal. A hush fell over the chamber. Outside, crowds gathered, listening to the crackling broadcast from old radios balanced on fruit stalls and taxi dashboards. But what truly changed the atmosphere was a single statement, delivered by an unexpected figure, a young legislator known for his normally cautious tone. He stood up, placed his hands on the desk, looked straight into the cameras and said, "Africa is rising. The Sahel is rising, and Jamaica must ask itself, who are we to stay bowed when our own ancestors refused to kneel? People across the island felt something ignite in their chests. There was anger, of course. Deep, simmering anger. Anger that so many years had been spent under systems that did not benefit them. Anger that decisions shaping national destiny had been muted, hidden, softened. But there was also sorrow. A collective generational sorrow that flowed through the voices of elders calling into radio stations throughout the night. Sister Marlene's voice cracked as she told her story on air. "We watched our young people leave," she said. "We watched our farmers struggle, our teachers burn out, our leaders bend. We waited for rescue from the same places that benefited from our hardship. And now we realize rescue was never coming. Yet even in that sorrow, a spark began to glow. Listeners started referencing events happening far across the ocean. They spoke of African nations reclaiming control of their resources. They spoke of young leaders refusing to bow. And when one caller mentioned a recent Ibrahim Traoré moment that had gone viral across the diaspora, silence filled the studio. Not silence of ignorance, but silence of recognition. Recognition that someone, somewhere, was doing what Jamaica had long been too afraid to attempt, speaking truth without trembling. Soon, community halls began filling. Churches opened their doors not only for worship, but for dialogue. Elders who had seldom spoken about politics suddenly found their voices. They told younger Jamaicans about Michael Manley's boldness, about the promises of the 1970s, about how the island had once tried to stand tall before being economically punished into silence. The younger generation listened with wide eyes. Many had never heard these stories before. Then the moment arrived that none of them expected. A set of documents, partially released by a parliamentary office, circulated online. Though incomplete and requiring independent verification, they hinted at financial constraints, policy obligations, and external pressures that had shaped Jamaica's direction for decades. The people were stunned. Betrayal, even rumored betrayal, cuts deeply when hope has been scarce. And as the island processed it all, one question rose again and again, whispered through living rooms and barbershops and church benches. If this is what has been happening behind our backs, what else lies in the shadows? And that was when the real earthquake began, because Jamaica was about to see something that would shake not only its politics, but its soul. Elder Patricia was sitting on her veranda in Clarendon when it happened. The sun was low, the breeze soft, the mango tree swaying like an old choir member warming up for the evening service. She was sipping ginger tea, half listening to the radio, when a neighbor shouted, "Turn on the television. Turn it on now." At first she thought it was another hurricane warning. Jamaica knew hurricanes the way elders knew arthritis, sudden, sharp, and merciless. But this was no storm of wind. It was a storm of revelation. Across the island, a video began to spread with the speed of gossip and the weight of scripture. A speech from far across the Atlantic, a voice from the Sahel, a young leader standing tall before the world, speaking of dignity, sovereignty, and honor. The clip pierced the Jamaican soul like a memory of something forgotten but never lost. Dr. Kingston, a retired lecturer in Montego Bay, leaned forward as he watched. He had studied decolonization for nearly 40 years, yet nothing had prepared him for the clarity of the message. "This is not arrogance," he whispered. "This is what truth sounds like when fear dies." Then came the moment the entire Caribbean would talk about: the firmness, the unshaken confidence, the refusal to kneel before global pressure. Viewers described their reaction as a kind of spiritual flashback. Jamaica remembering its own fire, Barbados remembering its steel, Trinidad recalling its drums. For many Jamaicans, this was the first time they felt a leader from abroad echo their own buried courage. Radio stations opened their hotlines that night, and what poured in was not just commentary, it was lamentation, it was testimony, it was confession. A 70-year-old caller from St. Catharines said, "For decades we watched ourselves shrink. We apologized, compromised, begged, borrowed, bent. Now I see a leader who refuses to tremble." Another elder broke down on air. "We used to have leaders like this. Strong, courageous, ready to defend the poor, ready to challenge the old order." The host's voice cracked as he replied, "We lost more than policies. We lost our backbone." Meanwhile, social media erupted. Young Jamaicans who had never lived through the political storms of the 1970s were suddenly asking questions their parents never dared to explore. They wanted to know why their economy felt chained, why opportunities seemed to belong to everyone except Jamaicans, and why decisions affecting them were always wrapped in polite, diplomatic vagueness. In one late-night broadcast, Sister Gloria, a retired schoolteacher, addressed the nation through a popular call-in program. Her voice quivered but held firm. "When you grow old," she said, "you learn to recognize truth. Truth does not stutter. Truth does not hide. Truth does not ask permission." And what I heard in that speech, yes, that one is truth ringing like a church bell. And then came the spark that set the diaspora ablaze. Clips of Jamaicans reacting traveled to London, Toronto, Brooklyn, Miami. Elderly Caribbean communities in the United States watched the Jamaican uproar with tears in their eyes. For them, the struggle for dignity had always been global. They remembered the civil rights marches, the boycotts, the bruises, the broken bones. They recognized the tone of a people rediscovering their worth. It was during one such broadcast that Major Thompson, a heavily decorated retired serviceman living in Ocho Rios, said something that struck the entire nation. Standing outside a community hall, he told reporters, "When a people have been silent for too long, their first shout will shake the world." The interviewer paused, taken aback by the force of his words. Major Thompson continued, "We were taught to wait, to obey, to be grateful for crumbs. But the world has changed. Africa has changed. Jamaica must change too. And whoever gave that speech, he reminded us of who we used to be. His stance is a mirror, and we do not always like the reflection." Around that time, one viral clip captured a Jamaican grandmother watching the video and whispering, "This is my Ibrahim Traoré reaction." I never knew courage could travel across the ocean. The phrase spread like wildfire, quoted in churches, on T-shirts, in the comments of diaspora live streams. It became a symbol not of the man alone, but of the awakening he had stirred. Yet amidst the emotional swell, Jamaica faced a quieter, more painful truth. If another nation's courage could inspire them so deeply, what did that say about the courage they had lost? By the fourth night, community centers were packed. Elders sat beside young men in hoodies. Grandmothers pressed hands against their chests. Daughters held the hands of aging fathers. The discussions grew intense. Were these long-standing agreements still fair? Had Jamaica been treated with equality or with condescension? Why had transparency been so rare? And most importantly, why had the people never been invited into the conversation? The island was not just reacting to a video. It was reacting to its own neglected dignity. And that was when the pressure grew too great to ignore. Somewhere deep inside the government, responses began swirling. Meetings were called. files reviewed, questions whispered behind closed doors. Because what Jamaica was about to do next would not be a reaction. It would be a reckoning. Mother Elaine always said that truth has 3 stages. It whispers, it wounds, and then it rebuilds. Jamaica had already heard the whisper, already felt the wound. But now came the part no nation can avoid, the moment of consequence. The moment when silence can no longer protect those who benefited from it. It began one morning when the Cabinet Office released a short statement acknowledging the public outcry. No full details, no confirmations, only a promise to review legacy arrangements with external partners. That phrase, so gentle and administrative, exploded across Jamaica like a dropped match in dry grass. Review what? Legacy of whom? Arranged by who? And for whose benefit? Councillor Hewitt, known for her calm and measured tone, stood before a packed community hall in St. James and said, "A review is not enough. We want clarity. We want accountability. And we want it in daylight." Her words carried through the radio waves, into kitchens and verandas, reaching elders who had lived through decades of political promises. Many of them had grown tired of committees, inquiries, and commissions that produced more dust than justice. But this time was different. The people were wide awake. Soon after, a local newspaper published what it described as partial summaries of historical agreements. Some points were publicly verifiable, others unverified and noted as requiring confirmation. Yet even fragments were enough to ignite outrage. Jamaica felt, for the first time in years, that decisions made decades earlier still sat like heavy chains around its ankles, chains reinforced by institutions far beyond its shores. In Spanish Town, Bishop Rowe gathered a large crowd beneath the open sky. He lifted his Bible not to preach doctrine, but to preach dignity. "A people cannot walk forward while their feet are tied," he declared. "And no nation should be bound by agreements they never consented to." A shout erupted from the crowd. It was not anger alone, it was grief. Generational grief. The kind that lives in the bones of the elderly and the memories of the poor. Then came something Jamaica had not seen in years. Cautious unity. For the first time in a long time, organizations that usually disagreed, church networks, trade unions, youth groups, diaspora councils, began to speak with one voice. They wanted transparency. They wanted sovereignty. Most of all, they wanted respect. On a radio panel that evening, Captain Sinclair, a retired naval officer, said something that silenced the entire studio. "We have spent decades living under the echo of other nations' ambitions. Maybe it is time to listen to our own." His words landed with the weight of prophecy. Meanwhile, across the diaspora, Jamaicans in New York, Birmingham, Toronto, and Miami held community meetings of their own. Many of them elderly, many of them lifelong advocates for Caribbean independence. They had suffered through immigration struggles, economic hardship, and cultural erasure. Now they watched their homeland awakening, and they felt something rise within themselves, something they feared had disappeared over time. For the first time in years, one elder in Brooklyn said, "I feel like Jamaica is remembering its worth." As public pressure grew, Jamaica took a step that shook diplomatic circles. The government announced the formation of a special oversight committee, one that would include economists, historians, legal scholars, and representatives of civil society, some of whom had long been sidelined. They were tasked with evaluating the fairness and relevance of older agreements, some dating back decades. Certain agreement names remain unverified and would require confirmation before being cited. But it did not end there. For the first time in its modern history, Jamaica publicly expressed interest in exploring new international alignments based on equality and mutual respect. While the statement was brief, analysts across the Caribbean immediately connected it to the wave of African nations reassessing their partnerships and reclaiming control of their resources. Bishop Rowe said it best during a Sunday sermon. "We are not turning against the world. We are turning towards ourselves." Crowds nodded, some wept, some lifted their hands in silent prayer. At community centers across the island, elders shared stories, long suppressed stories of the 1970s when Jamaica had attempted to chart its own path, only to face tremendous economic pressure. Young people listened with a mixture of awe and sadness. They had never been taught these histories in school. They had not realized how much courage had once lived in their own soil. Mother Elaine leaned on her cane, addressing a group of teenagers in Kingston. "Courage is not just standing up," she said. "It is remembering you have the right to stand at all." Her voice trembled. The teenagers leaned closer. And then came the question that swept through every living room, every church bench, every barbershop and community meeting. If Jamaica breaks away from the old system, what should be our first step? People argued passionately. Some said agriculture, some said education, some demanded full economic independence. Others insisted that Jamaica must first rebuild its confidence before rebuilding its economy. But beneath all the debate, there was one shared realization. Jamaica was no longer asleep. It was standing up. And the world was beginning to notice. Because the next response, the response from America and the global powers, would determine whether Jamaica's awakening blossomed into freedom or was crushed before dawn. Elder Morrison sat in his small apartment in Atlanta, the evening news flickering across his glasses. He had lived in the United States for more than 4 decades, marched in civil rights rallies, buried friends who never saw the world change, and watched the Caribbean shift from boldness to caution. But never, not once, had he seen American media speak of Jamaica with such unease. On one channel, analysts whispered about new political currents in the Caribbean. On another, a commentator warned that Jamaica might be drifting away from traditional partners. A third network quoted unnamed officials expressing concern about Jamaica's sudden assertiveness. To Elder Morrison, none of this was surprising. America had always watched the Caribbean not as a neighbor, but as a sphere of influence. And any sign of defiance, any hint that a small island might choose its own path sent shivers up the spines of those who preferred obedience. Yet across the United States, especially among older African Americans, the reaction was entirely different. In community halls in Detroit, in church basements in Chicago, in barbershops in Philadelphia, people spoke with a reverence normally reserved for sacred events. Professor Adele, a historian at Howard University, hosted a discussion that drew an overflowing crowd. She pointed to Jamaica's awakening and said, "This is not isolationism. This is reclamation. It mirrors the very heartbeat of Black history, the eternal struggle for self-determination." The room erupted in applause. Many elders wiped their eyes. They understood. They had lived through decades of systemic pressure, policy manipulation, and the quiet punishment of any nation or individual who dared to stand upright. Meanwhile, the reaction across Europe was cautious. Governments issued carefully crafted statements about stability and continuity. Britain watched intently, remembering its old colonial ties, its economic interests, and the fact that Jamaica asserting sovereignty would inspire other Caribbean nations to ask uncomfortable questions. In Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Dakar, newspapers celebrated. Caribbean commentators noticed African journalists praising Jamaica's courage as part of a wider wave of global black consciousness reconnecting across oceans. Sister Nadine, a Jamaican nurse living in Birmingham, said it beautifully during a televised interview. When one child in the family stands tall, the others remember how to straighten their backs too. But the reactions were not only emotional, they were strategic. Think tanks in Washington published new reports. Political advisors began quietly asking if the Caribbean was slipping beyond Western influence. Old alliances were revisited. New pressures whispered. Jamaica was not just a tropical island in the eyes of the world. It was now a symbol, a question mark, a warning, and a promise. Judge Hamilton, a respected Jamaican-born jurist in Canada, gave a speech that summarized the geopolitical tremor. When a small nation remembers its worth, great powers remember their fears. And just as the world began adjusting to this new Jamaican posture, diplomatic cables, private calls, and quiet visits started to multiply. Because everyone sensed what Jamaica was preparing to do next. A step bold enough to inspire or bold enough to provoke. And that step, that singular turning point, would redefine the future not only of Jamaica, but of the entire African diaspora. Father Emmanuel stood beneath the spreading guango tree at the edge of Portmore, its branches hanging like arms stretched in prayer. Around him, villagers gathered, young men with searching eyes, elderly women leaning on their canes, mothers holding the hands of curious children. The evening breeze carried the smell of salt and the ancient hum of Jamaican soil remembering its strength. He raised his hand and spoke softly. The question now is not whether Jamaica will rise. The question is how. It was a question echoing across every parish, every diaspora gathering, every family WhatsApp group. Jamaica had reached a crossroads not seen in generations. One road led back to the old familiar pattern sexternal dependency, muted sovereignty, quiet resignation. The other road pointed toward uncharted ground, new alliances, African re-engagement, agricultural rebirth, economic self-respect. Youth leader Carter, a young organizer from St. Thomas, stepped forward. If we are serious, he said, the first thing we must rebuild is our confidence. Not our currency, not our institutions, our confidence. Because no nation can rise if its people still bow in their minds. The elders nodded. They understood. Many had lived through the years when Jamaica had dared to dream big, only to be punished economically until its spirit cracked. They knew that before changing systems, Jamaica had to change its posture. Meanwhile, Elder Bernice, a gentle woman with silver hair and a fire still burning in her voice, leaned on her walking stick and declared, "We must teach the young our hidden history, the history that was erased, rewritten, softened. They must know what we survived. They must know what we lost. They must know what we almost forgot." Her words struck the crowd like a drumbeat. The older listeners wiped their eyes. The younger ones bowed their heads in respect. For the first time in many years, the generational divide was closing. Elders were no longer just the past. They were the compass. Young people were no longer just the future. They were the engine. Even the government, cautious, pressured, aware of the world's gaze, began signaling its intention to explore trade and educational partnerships with African nations. Specific agreements still pending confirmation. Analysts described it as symbolic, but the Jamaican people recognized something deeper, a spiritual relinking, a mending of a rope that had been cut by centuries of distance and design. Ambassador Rowland, speaking during a regional roundtable, summarized the new mood. If Jamaica walks this path with wisdom, we will not walk alone. Our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic have been waiting for us to remember who we are. The room fell silent, a hopeful, trembling silence. But Father Emmanuel knew the journey would not be easy. He looked over the crowd and said, "Every rising nation must pass through the valley of pressure. There will be resistance. There will be fear. There will be threats, temptations, and shadows. But if we stand as one family, Jamaica will cross the valley." The crowd murmured, "Amen." The sun dipped behind the horizon. The island seemed to inhale slowly, deeply, defiantly, because the next step Jamaica was preparing to take was not just political. It was ancestral. It was generational. It was spiritual. And that step, when it comes, will test not only Jamaica's courage, but the courage of every Black nation watching. There are moments in a nation's life when the road forward is no longer drawn by politicians, analysts, or distant institutions, but by the people who carry the deepest memories. Jamaica has reached such a moment, a turning, a trembling, a rising. Not loud like thunder, but steady like a heartbeat returning after years of exhaustion. For the elders across America and the Caribbean, this awakening feels familiar. You marched for justice. You fought for dignity. You buried friends who never lived to see freedom fulfilled. You carried stories that textbooks sanitized, and you kept alive the flame that others tried to smother. And now, as Jamaica stands tall again, you see the same flame rekindling across oceans. Some say it began with politics. Others say it began with desperation. But many elders believe it began with something deeper. The shock of seeing courage in a new place, in a young African voice, in an Ibrahim Traoré moment that echoed across the diaspora and refused to be forgotten. And when Jamaicans saw their own strength reflected in that mirror, something shifted, something awakened, something returned home. And as the reaction spread, it became more than admiration. It became a question, a challenge, an invitation. It became an Ibrahim Traoré reaction inside the Jamaican soul. What would we do if we remembered our own power? Now the island stands at the threshold of a new era. The world is watching. The elders are watching. The ancestors are watching. The next Ibrahim Traoré moment may not come from Africa. It may come from Jamaica herself, spoken by a grandmother, written by a farmer, voted by a youth who refuses to bow. But the future cannot be built by spectators. It must be built by family. By those who believe that the dignity of Black people, whether in Kingston, Harlem, Lagos, Bridgetown, or Birmingham, is not negotiable. So family, if this message stirs something in your spirit, if you feel the wind of change brushing your soul, if you believe we must stand together across the Atlantic, then press subscribe and walk with this growing African-Caribbean circle. Your voice matters. Your memory matters. Your courage matters. Before you go, share your wisdom below. Do you believe Jamaica's awakening will inspire other Black nations to rise, and what should the next generation inherit from us? The story is not ending. The story is gathering strength. And you are part of it.